Hello. In this short video, we're going to explain our paper on COVID-19 and trade policy, which will shortly be appearing in Critical Perspectives on International Business, in a special issue on the pandemic. Our team is myself, Louise Curran from Toulouse, an international business scholar, Jaap Eckert from York, a political scientist, and Jaemin Lee from Seoul, who's a trade lawyer. So, as COVID-19 spread across the world, governments were increasingly concerned about shortages of key products like protective equipment and ventilators. And one of their reactions was to ban trade, which is a pretty rare occurrence, as such restrictions are usually incompatible with World Trade Organization rules. So in addition, they were happening against the backdrop of a fragilized WTO, because the Trump administration had undermined it, both through its protectionist policies and its refusal to support its day-to-day work. So we decided that we wanted to look at these developments in more detail, and we posed three questions. So what kind of trade measures were governments taking in response to COVID-19? Were they compatible with WTO rules, or did they seem to indicate a shift in their interpretation, with implications for IB? So to explore these questions, we looked at a database from the International Trade Center of all COVID-related trade measures. And I'll pass over to Jaemin now to explain what we found.
Thank you, Louise. We extracted all of the restrictive trade measures in place in May last year and categorized them by country according to the World Bank's country categories, that is, high-income countries, upper middle-income countries, etc., and by product type. As you can see from the table in the slide, most of the measures restricted trade in medical goods, although food was also targeted, apparently because of fears about food security or contagion. Most restrictions were of exports, and very large number of measures were outright bans, which would be particularly difficult to justify under existing trade rules. We then looked in detail at the justification for these measures under trade agreements and assessed the extent to which they were probably compatible with the relevant WTO exceptions, which allow countries to restrict trade in certain circumstances, which are mainly GATT Article 20B on public health and GATT Article 21 on national security reasons. As you see in the table, the majority of the measures were judged to be probably compatible, here classified as green measures in the table, although a substantial minority were more questionable, which we classified as yellow. These included, for instance, Kenya's ban on used clothing imports and Sri Lanka's blockage of all imports. In addition, most of the measures we explore were not notified to the WTO, which is itself a breach of relevant WTO rules. And many of them had no end date, which raised questions about how long these barriers would persist in the future. Jaap will now say a few words about the implications we have found.
Yeah, so we can draw a couple of conclusions from this work for international business. First of all, the widespread use of measures that were probably WTO incompatible, so the yellow measures that we highlighted in the previous slide, undoubtedly undermines world trade rules going forward. This is concerning for multinational enterprises, as many of them rely on trade openness to facilitate the global value chain on which they depend. Secondly, government intervention is unlikely to retreat once COVID-19 is under control. The pandemic has fostered an intensive debate on the need for governments to secure access to strategic goods, including by reshoring production to ensure national sovereignty. Today, it's still uncertain how far governments will in fact intervene to achieve these broad policy objectives, but it's clear that multinational enterprises and their global strategies will need to pay increasing attention to public policy interventions. And us as scholars also need to follow these developments closely. If you're interested in the full version of the paper, you can follow the link on the screen here. Thank you.